All right, thank you for the songs. We'll be going to Isaiah chapter 64. So, in our study through Isaiah, this is now message number 82, entitled Rip Open the Heavens. And we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 64, verses 1 to 12. Oh, that thou wouldest rend the heavens, that thou wouldest come down, that the mountains might flow down at thy presence. As when the melting fire burneth, the fire causeth the waters to boil, to make thy name known to thine adversaries, that the nations may tremble at thy presence. When thou didst terrible things which we looked not for, thou camest down, the mountains flowed down at thy presence. For since the beginning of the world men have not heard, nor perceived by the ear, neither hath the eye seen, O God, beside thee, what he hath prepared for them that waiteth for him. Thou meetest him that rejoiceth and worketh righteousness, those that remember thee in thy ways. Behold, thou art wroth, for we have sinned. In those is continuance, and we shall be saved. But we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousness are as filthy rags. And we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind have taken us away. And there's none that calleth upon thy name, that stirreth up himself to take hold of thee. For thou hast hid thy face from us, and hast consumed us because of our iniquities. But now, O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou our potter, and we all are the work of thy hand. Be not wroth, very sore, O Lord, neither remember iniquity forever. Behold, see, we beseech thee, we are all thy people. Thy holy cities are a wilderness, Zion's a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and our beautiful house, where our fathers praised thee, is burned up with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste. Wilt thou refrain thyself for these things, O Lord? Wilt thou hold thy peace and afflict us very sore? So, chapter 63 envisioned those watchmen that were called upon to be watching for the redemption of Israel. And they see the warrior king approaching and coming from the great slaughter of his enemies. And his garments are described as being brightly colored, stained with the blood of those that he has trampled, as if he had been treading wines in or treading grapes in a wine press. But it wasn't the blood of grapes staining his apparel, but rather the blood of the nations that he has trampled. Now, the coming of Christ means the day of vengeance and also the day of redemption. And so, as we have seen from the start with Isaiah, judgment necessarily precedes restoration. The purging is going to come before the redemption. Now, this chapter in 63 turns with this national prayer of Israel, that is the latter part of it. And they long for covenant remembrance, for God to remember his promises. They long for a second Exodus where Israel is gathered and restored to the land and is redeemed and their enemies are defeated. And obviously, we saw the use of that Exodus imagery for God acting in remembrance of his covenant to make himself known and to make himself a great name. Now, in chapter 64, we're continuing with this national prayer of Israel, and we're getting Sinai imagery in this chapter. The prayer essentially is for God to come down and to shake the earth as he did at Sinai, because this will mean judgment of the enemies, and it will also mean the redemption of Israel. And so they want this to take place. Now, just like the penitential laments in the Psalms that we looked at some time ago, the prayer here confesses sin, asks God to take action, and really it ends this whole prayer essentially is put in the form of an unanswered question, at least here in the immediate context. So we'll look at this in two parts. Verses 1 to 7, which primarily take up the confession of Israel, and verses 8 to 12, which are Israel's appeal to the Lord. So we'll start here with verse number 1. Oh, that thou wouldest rend the heavens, that thou wouldest come down, that the mountains might flow down at thy presence. Well, chapter 63 ended with the nation of Israel dispersed from the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the complaint is that the people whose God the Lord is not are treading down the land, that land of inheritance, that promise to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. While the people, the nation that are called by his name, are exiled from it. They're scattered from off it, scattered among the nations, and afflicted. And there is a request for God to come down in judgment. Now, sometimes when we were in the Psalms, we would see laments that would ask for the Lord to rise up, to stand up and to take action. And this is along that same line. However, it is obviously dependent on the coming of the Lord to earth. And they're asking him to come and to take action. So this is the language of God coming to the earth in judgment, and of course in the person of the Messiah. And we have many such requests again as we go through the Psalms and these the prayers of the faithful and the afflicted and the moans and the cries that were under the oppression that was coming upon them. But nevertheless, there is promise of a deliverance coming, and so that is what these are based on. Now, the language in this part of the prayer certainly puts us in mind to think of Sinai, and back in Exodus chapter 19 in particular, and some of the references that we have to that in the Psalms as well. And at Sinai, God visited his nation. God came down to the mountain. His presence was upon the mountain. And remember the descriptions there, and the descriptions later by the writer of Hebrews, how that it wrought such fear in their hearts that they were afraid. They were afraid of the mountain, the quaking, and the voice of God, even so much that Israel asked God not to address them directly. Speak to Moses and let Moses speak to us. We can't tolerate hearing that voice. Well, this is essentially what they are looking forward to or anticipating and praying for, this shaking of the heaven and earth in the time of God's judgment, the day of his vengeance, as we saw in the previous chapter. So this is essentially the prayer that we've been reading. This is a prayer of the remnant in the time of tribulation that are looking for the Lord to come down to the earth to put an end to these judgments. And verse number 2, as when the melting fire burneth, the fire causeth the waters to boil, to make thy name known to thine adversaries, that the nations may tremble at thy presence. So the result, in other words, the result of the judgments that they're asking for, the results of the coming of the Lord that they're asking for, will be that he will be known, he will be revealed to the adversaries, and they will tremble before him. And you get quite a description of these judgments in the book of Revelation, as even those unbelievers upon whom these judgments come have no question in their mind about where they are from, about who is doing these terrible things, and they're trying to hide themselves. Now, this expresses something of a powerlessness of his enemies before him. They're not able to stand before his face. So the coming of the Lord in his anger, in his wrath, in his coming in vengeance, the unbeliever is not able to stand before him. And this was a repeated emphasis that we saw in the Exodus as well, that God was acting in such a way that his name would be known among the nations. And if you remember when we were in Exodus some time back, we noticed again and again how that it was emphasized that God was acting and God was intervening and God was doing things in such a way that there wasn't simply some human explanation of what was going on, and it was made evident that the God of Israel was judging Egypt and was delivering his nation. And so that's a similar sort of prayer, God to do things in such a way. And verse 3, this remembrance, when thou didst terrible things, which we looked not for, thou camest down, the mountains flowed down at thy presence. Now, again, we have this reference to Sinai, but again, it would include all of the events in Egypt with the Exodus and the leading them forth and the judgments that were brought. And notice what they said. They said that we didn't look for it. In other words, when they were in Egypt and they were crying out because of affliction, they may very well have prayed to be saved, to be delivered, to be rescued. They may have even prayed for something to be done to their enemies in Egypt that were afflicting them in the way that they were. But they never conceived of the plagues that came upon Egypt. There wasn't a prayer for the locust and the water to blood and all of they didn't. In other words, they did not know how that God was going to act to deliver them. They didn't know that. They didn't have any concept of that. But God came and did all of these mighty and terrible things in Egypt, far beyond anything that they could imagine. And even it's described as even the mountains flowed down at thy presence. It's sort of a poetic description of even the earth and the creation itself is just giving way before him, and his presence continues to emphasize before his face. Verse number 4, for since the beginning of the world, men have not heard nor perceived by the ear, neither hath the eye seen, O God, beside thee, what he hath prepared for him that waiteth for him. So this is given as an explanation following from verse number 3, these great and terrible things that God did that they didn't look for because they didn't know to look for these things. They didn't know what things it was that God was going to do, what was the means through which he was going to deliver them from Egypt. But there was a promise from over 400 years before when God gave that promise to Abraham in Genesis 15, I believe it was, that he was going to visit them and he would deliver them. But as far as how all that would be accomplished, it was not known. Now, this particular verse in verse 4, Paul actually quotes this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse number 9. And in the context there, Paul is talking about the difference between natural and spiritual understanding. And as you can see, the description here that men haven't heard, they've not perceived, they've not seen. And that, again, goes back to those things that they had asked not for. But there's an emphasis really in this verse on waiting. So we have God's terrible, unforeseen acts in Egypt to ransom his nation in remembrance of his covenant. And what happened in Egypt, the point is, it was not anything like business as usual. It wasn't anything like just sort of the flow of history. And with the flow of history, we have certain ebbs and flows and cyclical things. There's times of abundance and plenty and peace and prosperity, and there's times of great war and unrest, and there's times of great scarcity, and all of these things happen, and they just sort of kind of ebb and flow along throughout history. But that was not this. It wasn't that Egypt just had a bad crop that year. That nation was destroyed by God in extraordinary ways that no one would have ever looked for. So this is the point. It was a complete rupture of the natural order when God came down and visited his nation to deliver them from Egypt. And so waiting on the Lord then implies a trust in him and a patient endurance of the present circumstances, because God will keep his promises and is able and willing to accomplish his purposes in means that are far beyond what we can even imagine. So if we think about this maybe from another perspective, we say, oftentimes the circumstances look hopeless. They look hopeless because we don't know how to solve the problem. We don't know how to effect deliverance. We don't even know maybe specifically what to ask God to do other than deliver us or save us and what have you. But God is not limited by our human limitations. Just because eye had not seen, ear had not heard, man had never thought about what God did in Egypt, that didn't mean that was in any way hard for God to do, or that he was in any way hindered in doing it. So the desperation of the circumstances, again, God is not limited. Verse number 5, thou meetest him that rejoiceth and worketh righteousness, those that remember thee in thy ways. Behold, thou art wroth, for we have sinned. In those is continuance, and we shall be saved. So we're getting an explanation here of these things that's referred to at the end of verse number 4. And God comes and rewards. But then the second part of the verse shows a turn. And this is the character of God. This is how God rewards those who follow him in faith. But his wrath is against Israel because of their sin. So there's an acknowledgement here that they have not obeyed. That in continuance referring to the ways of God. And what this ultimately points to is the fact that it's because of God's faithfulness that Israel shall be saved. It's not because of their turning around. It's not because of anything that they can do or will do, but it's because of God's faithfulness that they will be saved. Verse 6 says, but we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. And we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, have taken us away. So there's a contrast here between future hope and present reality. And that, of course, is a contrast that all of us in this life, we live in the midst of. There's a difference between our present reality and our future hope. The present reality, Israel says, we are all unclean. And this has reference to, obviously, to ceremonial uncleanness, a thoroughly polluted, thoroughly defiled. The most polluted and defiled imaginable. And this reference to filthy rags, it's not just, some cloths with a little bit of dirt or grease or mud or something on them. It is the most polluted and defiled things imaginable. You can read of some of the laws there in Leviticus chapter 15 if you're interested in looking at that. It's just an expression. It's an acknowledgement. It's a confession that we're thoroughly corrupted. We are thoroughly corrupted and unclean before you. Their righteousnesses, they all fade like a leaf. They dry up and wither, and the iniquities of Israel blow them off the trees and among the nations. So they have no strength in themselves. They have no vitality in themselves. And their sins have just blown them among the nations like the wind that just blows the leaves off the tree in the fall when they start dying. And there is none, in verse 7, that calleth upon thy name, that stirreth up himself to take hold of thee. For thou hast hid thy face from us, and hast consumed us because of our iniquities. So there's actually a lamentation here for the lack of faithful prayer. And one way of looking at it, we could say there's a lamentation of the fact that there are many who have given up hope. They're not calling upon God. They're not stirring up themselves to take hold of thee. They confess that God has hidden his face from them, and it's very plain, even from earlier in Isaiah, that has occurred because of their sin. It is owing to their covenant unfaithfulness, to their transgressions against God, that this is the case. So once again, this is a very thoroughgoing confession. It's a confession of utter and thorough sinfulness and inability. They cannot make themselves holy. They cannot make themselves righteous. They cannot turn this nation to God. So then we get to the last part, beginning with verse 8, and this is the appeal. This is that follows the request of the beginning. But now, O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou our potter, and we all are the work of thy hand. Acknowledging depravity, acknowledging inability, acknowledging corruption, well, it leads to their calling on God as the only hope. There is no other. And notice the two images that are used here, that of father and that of potter and clay, father and children, potter and clay. And in both of these instances, the emphasis is on just the total dependence, and you can think of as young children, and just the total dependence on their parents for everything in life. And the potter and the clay, even more so, this imagery, and Isaiah has used this before, and they highlight the sovereignty of God and just the inability of man. And it also speaks to God's electing love and his self-purpose in creating Israel. We've already seen several references in Isaiah that speaks of God forming and making and creating Israel as a nation, and all these different words that are used to speak to the fact that God has done so intentionally. He has done so with purpose, a purpose that will be fulfilled. And so this appeals. Israel was not a nation before God created them a nation in keeping his promise to Abraham. And so now they are appealing on these bases, not what they've done, not what they're vowing to do in the future, not anything, but you're our Father. You've given us life. You're our creator. You're our maker. We're just a clay. You're our potter. You have formed us for your own purpose. And it's just an appeal, essentially, for God to fulfill his own purpose. Verse 9 says, "Be not wroth very sore, O Lord, neither remember iniquity forever. Behold, see, we beseech thee, we are all thy people." So this prayer is seeking for an end of God's anger and for salvation for Israel. And we've talked about in our study of Isaiah and correlating that with Daniel as well, that there's a time when God's indignation is going to be full. It's going to be filled up. His purpose and indignation against Israel is going to be completed. And from that time forward, we're told that he will never have indignation against them again. So that's essentially what's being prayed for this time to come to an end, the time of their iniquities and the time of God's indignation against them, for those to come to an end. And this, of course, is the promise. And the confession, we are all thy people. Again, that's Am in the singular with the possessive. We're your nation. It says, thy holy cities in verse 10 are a wilderness. Zion is a wilderness. Jerusalem, a desolation. Now, this was the desolation that was promised upon Israel because of their sin. But keep in mind that Isaiah is writing this somewhere around 100 years before Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed by the Babylonians. That's not occurred yet. And yet he is writing about that as if it has already happened. This is looking forward to that future confession and repentance of Israel. And we're seeing a lament of those of the remnant of the faithful that they see all of these things laid waste, just as it was said that they would be. Verse number 11 says, our holy and our beautiful house where our fathers praised thee is burned up with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste. This, of course, is lamenting the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, like that in Lamentations chapter 2, verses 1 to 9, though it still was, again, around 100 years away before it would happen. And then the ending question in verse number 12, wilt thou refrain thyself for these things, O Lord? Wilt thou hold thy peace and afflict us very sore? So now we're getting just an impassioned plea put in the form of these questions. Will you not act? How long will you refrain? Will you hold your peace? Will you just simply continue to afflict us? So again, it is that covenantal type of prayer that we witness so oftentimes in the Psalms. And sometimes those prayers can make very bold statements that make people a little uneasy. We just don't like them, and we try to explain them away. We don't want to deal with them. We don't want to acknowledge them that they're there. But when we understand these are prayers based in God's covenant promises, this is what God himself has sworn by his own name that he's going to do. And so it is that sort of a prayer asking God to act, to do what he has promised to do what he has sworn to do, to act, to seek him acting. Now, of course, we know he will act, and he will act in that time that he has appointed. Just as we saw at the end of the chapter, a couple chapters or so ago, he will hasten to do it quickly. When he does it, he will do it quickly when that time comes. Now, this confession, obviously, in this prayer we've seen, it sets us up for these last two chapters. But this confession acknowledges the desperate situation for the nation of Israel. Long exile, judgment. And they've brought judgment on themselves, and that's why we see this as a penitential prayer. They've brought judgment upon themselves for their disobedience and their rebellion. But there's also an acknowledgement here of the fact that they can't save themselves. They can't, again, make themselves righteous. They can't make the nation holy. Well, this chapter reinforces that God fulfills his promises. And the way that he fulfills them is really just beyond human imagination. And so it teaches us, even us today, it teaches us that don't limit based on human ability and even present circumstances just because those look impossible to us. And they probably are impossible to us. And in the case of Israel, there are things here that certainly was impossible for them to effect. And oftentimes that is true. Our present circumstances are something that we can't see or get out of, so to speak, but we should never limit God or think of God as being limited to our human abilities and our human comprehension. I believe this is part of why Paul spoke about in Romans 8, the Holy Spirit making intercession for us with groanings that cannot be uttered. And speaking of how even that our knowledge is so limited that our prayers are very weak in many ways. They're very short-sighted in many ways. So just as Israel is to have hope and is to pray for these things to come, and we as well pray for God to fulfill all of His promises and for the Lord to come. And that's really, when you look at these last couple of chapters in particular, it's really been about the coming of the Lord in particular. And that's really the essence of the prayer here, for God's presence to come to the earth, of course, in the person of the Messiah. All right, we will stop here and we will close with a hymn.